Two men walked into a recording studio, sat across from each other, and did something they had somehow never done in over 60 years of making music together. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr recorded a proper duet, a real song built for two voices, not a cameo, not an overdub, not a guest appearance layered onto someone else's session. The song is called Home to Us, and from the moment it reached listeners, something quiet and irreversible happened in living rooms and cars and kitchens across the world. Paul McCartney is 82. Ringo Starr is 85. Between the two of them sits more than a century of lived history, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, they happen to be part of the most famous rock band the world has ever produced. They stood on the Ed Sullivan Show stage when America still watched television in black and white. They played that final rooftop concert above Applecore in London, while the city below them had no idea they were witnessing the last chapter of something. And they survived Beatlemania, which was unlike anything any human beings had ever been asked to endure before it. And then they survived the end of the Beatles, which by most accounts turned out to be considerably harder. What remains now is two men who have been friends for more than 60 years in the deepest, most weathered sense of that word. Not business partners, not bandmates held together by a contract someone else wrote. Friends who have seen each other through the absolute worst of it, and that distinction matters more than anything else about this song. Paul has said over the years that Ringo makes him feel young, not because Ringo is young, but because Ringo has carried the same warmth and the same generous, funny presence since the day they first met in Liverpool. 60 years of constancy turns out to be its own kind of miracle, and that miracle is what Home to Us grew out of. But the question worth sitting with is why 60 years passed before they got here. The answer lives inside just how completely the Beatles' end detonated everything around it. The breakup in 1970 wasn't a quiet dissolving where four men simply went their separate ways and wished each other well. It erupted. Lawsuits spread between former members. Royalty disputes dragged through courts for years, and the Alan Klein era drew a hard legal line with John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr on one side while McCartney fought from the other. Stepping into a studio together during those years wasn't just unlikely, it was legally and emotionally off the table entirely. And that's when their separate lives took root in earnest. Paul built a solo career in popular music that would have made most artists envious regardless of where it came from, releasing albums that filled arenas for 5 decades straight. Ringo made records, appeared in films, and toured the world with his all-star band, playing to crowds who came specifically because of what that name still carried. They showed up on each other's solo work occasionally, Ringo playing drums on Paul's tracks, Paul contributing to Ringo's albums, but always as a guest, never as two equal voices sharing the front of the same song. A proper duet demands something different from both people, a kind of readiness that may only arrive when the arithmetic of time becomes impossible to ignore. What finally moved this from possibility to something real traces back to Now and Then, the final Beatles track released in 2023, assembled using artificial intelligence to restore John Lennon's vocals from an old cassette tape. Completing that song, hearing all four of them together in some form again, reminded Paul and Ringo that the music doesn't stop just because the calendar keeps moving. If anything, finishing Now and Then stirred something that had been sitting quietly for years, a reminder that they were still here, that the story hadn't closed. Home to Us is a quiet song, and that registers immediately. The arrangement stays spare and deliberate, built from acoustic guitar, a gentle piano line, and brush drums that land almost like a whisper. You can hear the room they recorded in, which is not an accident in the production. This wasn't built to fill a stadium, it was built to feel like a conversation between two people who have known each other longer than most of their listeners have been alive. The melody carries that warmth McCartney has always known how to locate, the note that sits right at the center of the chest and presses gently without forcing anything. What stands out most, though, is how much space the song carves out for Ringo. His voice has never been the flashiest instrument in any room, but it has always been honest, and here it carries the verses with a plainness that feels almost radical given who these two men are. No vocal acrobatics, no performance constructed for an audience, just two old friends singing to each other, and the simplicity of that choice ends up being the most powerful thing about it. The lyrical subject is exactly what the title promises. Home, not as a physical address but as a feeling. Home as the people who knew you before Liverpool turned into legend, before the screaming crowds and the worldwide fame that followed and changed everything it touched. At 82 and 85, that word arrives loaded with decades of meaning. It means Hamburg. It means the Cavern Club. It means John Lennon and George Harrison. And it means every morning, every loss, and every strange, beautiful, impossible thing that came with living the life these two men actually lived. Buried in the bridge, there's a melodic phrase that Beatles scholars have noted closely resembles the opening bars of In My Life, one of the most beloved songs John Lennon ever wrote. Whether McCartney placed it there deliberately or it surfaced from somewhere deeper in the writing process doesn't change what it does when you hear it. It floats through the middle of a song about home, like a quiet acknowledgement of the people who are no longer in the room but somehow remain present in it anyway. That kind of musical gesture doesn't need explaining, and it doesn't ask for any. Paul has spoken about the recording with real reverence, describing the experience of sitting across from Ringo and singing together as a proper duet for the first time as coming full circle. He talked about looking at Ringo's face during the vocal tracking and feeling something he struggled to put into precise words. These are two men who have stood together at funerals, who sat side by side in 1980, when John was shot outside the Dakota and the world stopped making recognizable sense, who were there for each other in 2001, when George Harrison died, and the Beatles became permanently a pair. Recording this song felt like honoring all of it, not just the British invasion or the history of rock and roll or the albums that changed popular music, but the entire strange, painful, beautiful journey that started in Liverpool more than 6 decades ago. He also said something simpler, and it's the part that stays longest after everything else fades. Ringo makes him feel safe. And making music together, finally, properly, as equals carrying the same song, felt like the most natural thing they had ever done, even though 60 years went by before they got there. When Home to Us reached the public, the response was quieter than Beatlemania and cut considerably deeper. People weren't screaming. They were crying at kitchen tables, calling their parents, texting their adult children links to the song with nothing written in the message because no words existed for what they wanted to say. Social media filled with Beatles memories, first records purchased, concerts witnessed in 1964 and 1966, songs that carried people through divorces and losses and the long dark years that nobody around them fully understood. One fan who had been at Shea Stadium in 1965 as a teenager wrote simply, "I didn't know how much I needed this." That's the whole thing right there in one sentence. Home to Us is not a nostalgia project, and it's not two elderly men looking backward at what used to be. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, at 82 and 85, made a choice to show up, to make something new, to say plainly that the music connecting them to 60 years of listeners across the history of popular music has not finished yet. Home for these two men is not a place they left behind somewhere in the past. It's something they've been building together, note by note across their entire lives. And with this song, they added one more room to it.